embarrassed, rejected, alone. Which makes the hour of noon the perfect time, the hottest point of the day. Certainly no one else will be there being the well. After all, anybody in their right mind would go to the well to draw water in the morning when it was still cool out. No, the noon hour is the perfect time. It's the hottest time of the day. It's then that I shall go there. Embarrassed, rejected by community members, and alone. Everything was perfect. The hour was noon. The jar was empty. Well, mostly empty. There was still some stuff in the bottom of the jar. You know what I'm talking about? It's like after doing the dishes and you let out the water and you have to clean out the strainer. You know what that looks like, don't you? You know, the sediment from that which didn't get into our mouths and into our stomachs, that which was left on the plate, that which after being washed off of the plate, why, there it sits in the bottom of the strainer. And it's gross. But it's there. We find the same substance at the bottom of the jar that this woman who comes to the well at noon, embarrassed, rejected, and alone, why, there at the bottom of the jar you will find that sediment, much like your sink strainer, and there you'll find the sediment of sarcasm. Did you catch the sarcasm in the woman at the well today? There's always the sarcasm that's there in the statements as Jesus tries to enter into conversation with her. And why, so there at the bottom of the jar is that sarcasm, that cynicism, that edge about her. The same, perhaps, edge and cynicism and sarcasm that if we're attentive enough, we realize is at the bottom of our jar as well. But even though it's there, the good news is for the woman at the well and for you and I, is that at least for her, hopefully for you and I, the jar was empty. Embarrassment, rejection, aloneness, that creates empty jars. And it is in that emptiness, even though the sediment is sitting at the bottom, it's in that emptiness that Jesus comes. And it's in the emptiness that he engages the woman at the well in conversation, noticing that Jesus, he just destroys all social barriers. He will have none of it. And yet, by doing so, he makes himself vulnerable as well. Because he, a man, is talking, a Jewish man, by the way, talking to a Samaritan woman. And then to want water from her unpurified Samaritan jar makes matters even worse. And yet, he takes a risk. He makes himself vulnerable and, might I add, unclean, so that he might enter into her emptiness, so that she might begin to discover that there's room in that emptiness. At first, she's convinced is just a Jewish man. And from there, if you pay attention to the dialogue and the conversation that her and Jesus are having, she moves from acknowledging him to be a Jew, and then she moves on to say, well, maybe you're a prophet. And then from a prophet, it's, well, perhaps, could you be the Christ? See what happens to the woman, the same thing that happens to you and I as we come on this journey of life and as we allow, hopefully, the vessel which is our life that is oftentimes filled up with all kinds of other stuff. So oftentimes that sediment of cynicism and sarcasm and negativity can why it can fill our jar to the brim, so that there's no room. There is no emptiness for Jesus to enter there. But the woman at the well invites you and I to allow Christ in, to be vulnerable like Christ chose to be, to allow ourselves in our emptiness in the times that we too are embarrassed, in the times that we too are alone, at the times that we too are convinced that we have been rejected by others. Could it possibly be at those times when we are lonely and afraid and uncertain and wondering and questioning and confused by the mystery which is life itself, could it be at those times that we can allow the living water to be poured into our hearts, as Paul reminds us in today's second reading? Jesus Christ pours out into our hearts the very gift of his Spirit. But in order for that to happen, we need to make room in the jar. Because in making room, notice what happens. Her jar is filled to the point that she can leave the actual earthen vessel jar at the well. And she who becomes filled with this living water, why, she runs to town. And she tells others, those same others that had already rejected her and considered her, well, the outcast. That doesn't stop her, because it never does. Once we have been filled, once we have encountered living water, once we know that we are loved and that we are forgiven and that we are accepted by God, even though our vessel has sediment in it, even though our vessel is perhaps cracked and or chipped, we have a God who loves us nonetheless. And because of that, when we experience that, as the woman did today, we leave that one vessel behind, and we take the true vessel, the one that was once empty, the one that was once ugly, the one that was once embarrassed and rejected and alone and empty. And we discover in the one who we seek, who can quench our thirst, the living water that we desire. And the vessel is full. And we are loved. And mercy is ours to share.